Well, hello, everybody. I'm Linda Chisholm. On behalf of WITS Press and the Centre for Education, Rights and Transformation at UJ, I really want to welcome everybody to the webinar today of Kevin Shillington's beautifully written biography of Patrick van Rensburg, a legend in his own time, we all know. In a very readable text, Shillington very skillfully interweaves the personal, political and educational dimensions of his life, and that's what we're going to be discussing today. We have three speakers today, Kevin himself, Bana Bodhisang and Salim Valley. Let me say a little bit about each of them, but before I do that, let me just give you an idea of the program. Kevin and Babana will each speak for about 5 to 7 minutes, maybe Kevin a little bit longer, and Salim Valley will then be in conversation with both of them until 4:45 when we open up for questions. So please feel free to post your comments and your questions in the chat, and we'll take them up during the remaining half an hour that we'll have. The session will be recorded and it will be posted to WITS Press's social media, so it will be available. Don't worry about that. So just a few words about each person in the order in which they will speak. Many of you will know Kevin Shillington. He graduated in modern history from Trinity College, Dublin. He's got a long experience in Africa, starting teaching as a teacher of African history and English for 6 years in secondary schools in Zambia, and then an MA and a PhD in African history from SOAS at the University of London. Thereafter, he went to Botswana, where he taught history and trained history teachers at the University of Botswana during the 1980s, before leaving and going back to the UK, where he established himself as an independent historian and wrote a string of books on African history and biography. Some of you may know his book, Luca Yankee, which was published by WITS Press in 2012 and is about Luca Yankee's struggle against colonialism in the 19th century Northern Cape. Some of you may also probably know his best-selling History of Africa, which is now in its 4th edition, and the most recently published edition of which was dedicated to the history students of Botswana who inspired the 1st edition. Patrick van Rensburg is his 7th biography, an accomplished historian. After him, Babana Bodhisang will speak. She has worked closely with Patrick van Rensburg on a number of publication projects. She's on the board of trustees of the Foundation for Education with Production, and she has just completed a definitive bibliography of publications by and about Patrick. So she will talk to that. Salim Valley, who will engage both of them in conversation, is also well known. He's the director for the Centre for Education, Rights and Transformation and the Saatchi Chair in Community, Adult and Worker Education at the University of Johannesburg. As a public intellectual, he's very well known for his educational activism, specifically around some of the shibboleths relating to the relationship between education and the economy. But he's also written extensively on various aspects of rights in education, as well as on social movements in education. His most recent edited volumes dealing with these issues are firstly with Enver Matala, Education, Economy and Society, and then 2 recent books edited with Aziz Chowdhury. The first one, History Schools, Reflections on Knowledge, Learning and Social Movements, and the second one, Universities and Social Justice. Over to you, Kevin. You're muted. Unmute yourself.
Sorry, I didn't realize I was muted. Thank you very much, Linda, for your very generous introduction. I'd like to just start with a quick few acknowledgements, people without whom this project may not ever have happened. There are full acknowledgements in the book, but I'd just like to mention a few. Firstly, the family, Patrick family, all 5 of them, who've been extremely supportive, but made no attempt to influence my portrayal. Anybody that I spoke to might have been trying to influence me by what they told me, but nothing beyond that. I thank also Peter Callaway, from a professor from the University of Cape Town, who first suggested the idea to me. I'm very grateful to him. I jumped at the chance, which I think rather surprised him. And Professor Anne Major, who provided some research funding for a trip to Cape Town to interview some key people. And finally, the board of the Foundation for Education with Production, FEP, whose generous financial support made it possible for me to make research trips from the UK. So having thanked all of those again, I'd just like to say that I feel it's been a great privilege to be able to research and write this book. I love writing biography. I think as a historian, I see biography as a window into the past. Not many people like reading straight history. They find it a bit too dry and dusty. But biography, by focusing on a person, opens up whole avenues of knowledge. It also gives access to a huge range of people whom one can interview, from the humblest, in my case, Thatcher and taxi driver, to the heights of academe and political figures. Even I was fortunate to be able to speak with former Botswana President Maseri just a few months before he passed away. So I feel very privileged and excited whenever I get started on a new biography. In writing biography, one needs to establish empathy, but not necessarily overboard on that. One needs also to establish a certain distance in order to be able to be a little bit critical and not just see everything through the eyes of one's subject. Patrick, how he saw himself, he did write an unpublished autobiography, which was extremely helpful, but I've focused as hard as I can on getting other views so as to look fairly critically at that. Patrick, brought up from a broken family and saw racism as the natural order of things in South Africa. In due course, he immersed himself in Afrikanerdom when he learned about his supposed Afrikaner paternity. And this was at the beginning of the apartheid era. And it was all a great revelation to him. He kept sort of changing his concept of his identity. But in due course, he saw the light and gradually became more and more uneasy about the racism and apartheid and so on. In due course, when he was a diplomat serving in the Congo, he finally made the decision, I must break with this whole system. And he really rebelled against it. It was taken extremely seriously by the authorities in South Africa, who saw him as an absolute traitor, an Afrikaner, who then starts allying with the anti-apartheid and across all racial boundaries, including being a pioneer in the boycott movement that led to the anti-apartheid movement in London. So in the aftermath of the Sharpeville massacre, of course, he was driven into exile. And his coming back to Botswana then at the age of 30 was a critical point in his career. Now, I've given quite a lot of focus in the book on that first 30 years of his life, because I felt I need to account for what made this man special, what made him so different, what made him driven and determined to do what he felt was best for all the people. He was aiming at a form of real rural development. He saw apartheid as a combination of elitism and racism. It was neither one nor the other, but a deliberate political construct. And he thought in any development work, rural development especially, that he wanted to do, the one thing, he took it for granted that racism would go with the end of colonialism, but elitism was something that he focused very much on trying to prevent. Botswana in 1962, the poorest country in the world, migrant labor, dependent on migrant labor to South Africa, So he wanted to focus on rural self-sufficiency, so that people didn't need to leave the rural areas where in those days most of the people still lived. And he started a secondary school, Swanning Hill, inspired by the first year's intake. And this was a group of people that he had taught for a short period, 6 months, at primary school. They were the primary school leavers who had not got a place in the very few secondary schools available. And he decided, I'm going to take first come, first served. And he started his class with a non-select group of people. And they were absolutely inspiring to him. They really led him along the path that he ended up going. They accepted the voluntarism of providing their own labor as well as working in the classroom in order to help build the school and run it. And from this, he then saw, what about all the others? I can only take one class at a time, an additional class next year, and so on. And it's from that desire to bring these ideas to a larger group that he founded the brigades for those who couldn't get into his secondary school. And they were training in productive activity. So they were combining academic education and vocational education. And from this, by making it productive, he was able to partly self-finance that education. And it is from this that he gradually, by trial and error, developed his own ideas of education with production. Dr. Chiepi, who was the Minister of Education in the late 1990s, told me Patrick did not just teach students how to make bricks. He taught them how to lay them in actual building, and all at no expense to government. So there are certain people within the Botswana Ministry of Education and political leaders who appreciated Patrick's ideas, but the general run-of-the-mill, most the education establishment and most politicians were always a bit suspicious. Patrick was too left-wing. They saw him as possibly a communist who would be corrupting the youth. And he was actually accused of corrupting the youth of Botswana. So he had a lot of difficulty, a really uphill battle at the time. And what I admire about him was he kept going. He would develop new ideas and he would keep plugging. If one thing didn't work, right, don't give up, try something else. Push, push, push all the time. A really inspirational character. In due course, I mean, we can talk further perhaps during the discussion further about how this was advanced further beyond Botswana, and his attempt after South African liberation to bring his ideas into South Africa, and the extent to which that really basically didn't work, and why. But I think let's leave that until we get to further into discussion. I'd just like to sort of conclude this particular introduction by referring to the liberation of Zimbabwe in 1980. That Patrick saw, this is the beginning of the real liberation of Southern Africa, and in due course perhaps South Africa. He thought, this is the country. I've been struggling in Botswana against the educational establishment and so on. In Zimbabwe, supposedly a socialist government coming in, here is where I will launch a foundation to promote my ideas. And that is how and when he founded the Foundation for Education with Production. Now, at this point, I think I should pass over to the next speaker, Bobana Badisan, who will tell us more about that foundation of which he is a board member, and also about a bibliography, totally comprehensive bibliography, annotated as well, that she has assembled, both by Patrick van Rensburg and about him. So over to you, Bobana.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Once more, congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you.
And it keeps on taking one back to guilty land. So let me welcome everyone and say from the Botswana side, Ntate Patrick van Rensburg, commonly known as Mareisbeck in Serowe, 1931. His regiment, he's of a regiment of Mafetsa Kang regiment. This is the age regiment. As a respected, as a luminary, the father of Swaning, and of course the father of Masero, who is his eldest son, Tom, the father of Mutusi, the sort of the Khosana, or the head person of Swanengod, the citizen of the world as he came to be known. And I would just like to take us from his writings, through his writings, from Guilty Land in 1962 to No Longer Guilty Land. He wrote No Longer Guilty Land in 2005, now after breaking away from apartheid. This is a person who was propelled by imagination, commitment, drive, egalitarianism. And for Kevin, I would like to us to look at the educationist sort of cognitive constructivism. When Pat, commonly known as Pat in the newsroom in Miri, him and I had been in the Miri Publishing Trust as well. And at some point I chaired the Miri Publishing House, which is publishing the bibliography. Pat, having been socially constructed within an Anglophile setting, you know, in the straight and narrow of Catholicism, and I mean French, extreme segregation or apartheid. South Africa was fluent in English, in French, in Afrikaans, and no one knows, but he was also highly competent or fluent in Setswana. So this is a person who was attracted more to science. And I'm taking you back to cognitive constructivism because he had an inquiry mind to find out how things work. I think hence, as a refined reader who was well seasoned at some point at the age of 12, under the care of Mama Suzanne, having visited the public library and really saw the light, selecting his own book with a supple muscle, well-toned, the writing muscle, the reading muscle. You'll recall that he actually, his first love was journalism because he published his own magazine, the Goodwill magazine. I'm taking you to FEP, this Goodwill magazine. It's something that, you know, we would like to revive. Behind me here on the shelf is Patrick's, you know, his reading list, as well as his publishing track record. And as you can see, some of the way these are his readings. The way he would bookmark everything so carefully. These are the things I would like Kevin maybe to bring out in the next in the next, because I think there's a lot again that can be written about Pat that we haven't really covered. After this, after the publication, the Goodwill magazine, he also, brings us into the revelation of the recognition, constructing his own truth about racism, where he reads, he goes to the public library, yes, another legal deposit library, and falls in love with the reading room, where he reads works that have been written by Africans, and for the first time, he cannot believe that people of Africanerdom have writings, people from Asian or Asian orientation are also, writers. He reads this, and then through that again, he constructs his own truth. And then at the embassy in Leopoldville, I think this is another awakening period where Pat interacts with more people, including the Tennysons. Okay, this is in Ghana. But I would like to bring out his, imaginativeness in Eswatini, where he learns about education with production, where they have the work camps. And then in Ghana, he learns about this technical skills brigades. I keep on calling it the technical skills brigades as an index, as opposed to the, the battalions, the military brigades. Then in another country, he sort of, in Ikopo, where he went to school, he learns about production, and he also gets to, when his guardian teaches him about, when he becomes the apprentice, constructing an extension to their guest quarters, and designing, and learning to mix the cement and everything. These are sort of, in Setswana, we say, meaning, charity begins at home. He's learned by doing. And then this is why we have, a whole lot of education with production literature. That as the foundation for education with production, we have to perpetuate. Let me say, Pat, in Southern Africa, in the SADC engaged him. And our very first concrete project is the biography. And then comes the bibliography. And then again, Pat's reading list that is so long of his writings, the technical reports, the journal articles, the newspaper articles, writings about him. And then let me also acknowledge the scholars, including Neil Parsons and Don Kati from the former NIR, National Institute of Research, where I used to work as a documentalist, where we have a lot of literature on the works, the brigades movement, as well as the technical vocational schools. So Pat has contributed a lot to this wealth of literature, such that we've come up with about 360 entries, and we know there's still more in University UCT, where he has at some point taught, and KZN, and we know there must be other works in London, in Britain, when he was also facilitating, organizing, writing reports, and even raising funds. And the brigades and the vocational trainings, the cooperatives also. The cooperatives. These bring in his writings on the report from Swanen, reports from Botswana, the Patrick van Rensburg, looking forward from Seruwe, reports on development, dialogue, that a lot of publications. And one thing that he has, contributed to is the vision 2036 and the vision 2016. Now, PET in Southern Africa with the education for, with the Foundation for Education with Production, worked with the SADC institutions in Southern Africa to disseminate and even make sure that we embrace in Southern Africa education with production. But as Kevin has pointed out in the chapters that talks about Southern Africa, you will experience his hurdles as he was, introducing education with production in the Bertram's project, in the other projects, and that really now the role that we have to play as the Foundation for Education with Production is to make sure we perpetuate this legacy. And the Miri Wadikang, that became Miri the Reporter, and then there's a Miri Monitor, all those publications we've got to be uplifting and making sure that this legacy is perpetuated. This is now the role of the Foundation for Education with Production. I think with that, Kevin will go on to Salim, who's done some research work on PET. I think these are the highlights that I wanted to bring out. And once, congratulations and thank you very much, Kevin, because where Bessie Head wrote English like an angel and wrote a lot about Patrick in this Sirowe, in her Sirowe book. And then Patrick wrote a lot even, with interviews about Bessie Head. And then as he was going towards losing his memory, he would bring some information to me, all this literature. And he just told me to see what I could do with it. So I thought, okay, seeing what we could do with it was to make sure that really we publish his writings. And Kevin, you have, passionately put that into context. Thank you
very much.
That's on my Thank you.
Thank you. Salim,
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Wonderful. We'll pursue that discussion, I'm sure.
Yes,
thanks very much, Linda. And again, thanks, Kevin, for a wonderful book. People, obviously, you can't comment on the style, the literary style, but others have. And it really paints the picture. It draws Patrick in a way that is understood by so many people who knew him, who struggled with him, who worked with him. And I think it captures his energy, his determination, as Bobana said, despite the difficulties and what you talked about, his perseverance. And, Linda's blurb, I think, is very important. The book captures Patrick's great appetite for life, but simultaneously it paints the picture of, as Linda says, a semi-heroic and a semi-tragic character. And I want to come back to that, but I just want to say, Kevin, the point you made, and quite often those of us who work with important personalities who have contributed so immensely to our struggle for a better life are overawed, but you've managed to paint a picture of the history of not only the man, but the movements, the vision, the hopes, the aspirations of many people in this part of our continent. It's no hagiography, and as you said, it's an empathetic portrayal but it's also a critical portrayal. And some of the chapters, chapter 13, the time of crisis, captures that, as well as the very fascinating relationship Patrick had with Bessie Head, for example, and the conflicts, but also the absolute support that they gave each other in different ways. But I just want to say that also before he invented himself as an educationist, reinvented himself as an educationist, which challenged the conventional understanding of education policy and practice with his praxis, with education, with production. He already made his mark in so many different ways. Bobana talks about the guilty land. That was written, Bobana, if I'm not mistaken, when he was 29 years old. You know, but all the fact that he received the Right Livelihood Award, he was the second person, if I'm not mistaken, to receive this. The way he set up the forerunner of the anti-apartheid movement in London, with representatives of the liberation movement, the boycott movement. And there's wonderful illustrations in the book, Kevin, the one on the boycott movement with the sponsors that he went out with Tennyson to get people like Bertrand Russell, Doris Lessing, John Berger, and many others. I mean, it's just a fascinating history. His participation in the All African People's Convention, hosted by Kwame Nkrumah, Julius Nyerere, the president of Tanzania's Mwalimu's opening of the seminar, I think in the mid-70s, his absolute devastation when Maurice Bishop in Grenada was assassinated, the plans he had with the new dual movement in Grenada to put into practice. And he saw, as you put it, Maurice Bishop as a kindred soul. I mean, these are all these details which you didn't have the time to cover. But I wanted to ask the question, and first of all, just as somebody who's been involved in education and alternatives in education for a few decades, I just want to thank the Foundation for Education with Production, Bobana, for the bibliography. That is such vital material at a time when we are told there is no alternative. You know, Patrick wanted a different trajectory to development, and there were different trajectories. Besides Education with Production, there was the influence of Paulo Freire on our country, on not just literacy, but the Black consciousness movement, Steve Biko, what they did with conscientization. But this was the broader purpose of education, not the instrumental, the banal, the reductive. And I think that this book properly situates Patrick van Rensburg and the people he worked with, which should not be forgotten. And that portrayal, thank you, Kevin, is also wonderful. The Robert Oakeshotts and many, many others, the people who came to volunteer, and their hard work, their expertise, their skills, their knowledge. I think the one final point on the character is, you know, besides the determination, the perseverance and hard work, is also the humor. And I think that is absolutely essential while he's digging this trench in Serowe, Bobana. He tells people that, as conveyed by Kevin, that Rome wasn't built in a day, but then, you know, he wasn't the foreman overseeing that job about building Rome. And he never lost this humor. It's self-deprecating humor when Joanne gave him a copy after he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's of The Guilty Land. He was thrilled, of course, and he quipped that he's probably the last Maoist standing. So this is the character of the man. I want to firstly just ask Kevin about the role of the memoirs, both what Liz had a light edit over it, as well as Joanne. Pass that on to you. What role did that play in assembling the book? And Bobana, in terms of the bibliography, the rich ideas, not just ideas, of course, the theory and the praxis behind you captured there. What are the plans of the foundation to make this available, accessible? Could you perhaps tell us about that? I can see so many questions already. I really don't want to take away from the time. We do have enough time, so I just want to make, for a minute or so, Linda, I just want to mention that, you know, in 2001, as Bobana will tell us, that Patrick was working on this book, Making Education Work, the what, why, and how of education with production. And there he talked about his deep disappointment. He felt quite clearly at that time that the vision he had would not materialize. And he wrote, and I quote, the government has opted to maintain socio-economic policies it inherited. And he bemoaned the fact that there was little socialist or revolutionary zeal. And I quote again, and this is a very significant quote as far as I'm concerned. He was writing about South Africa. South Africa seems now to hold alternatives in contempt. A strong statement, but I think it's important for us to mention this. I'm not sure if I agree with the sentiment that perhaps education with production may have been perceived by the government in South Africa and others in the region as too closely aligned, and I'm quoting, to Bantu education. Bantu education's formed of sorts of low-level technical skills, you know, harking back to the Verwoerdian hewers of wood and drawers of water, and it was too uncomfortably close to that. I think that, you know, that's it's not too difficult to see in his writings and his practice that was far from the practice, that this was about the difference between, you know, about the mental and the manual labor, conception and execution, understanding work in a particular way, socially useful work. All of these issues has a long history, a proud history in working class movements around the world. And I disagree with that view. I think it's a bit too simple, because the new state had the same attitude towards others, like Neville Alexander, who also contributed tremendously to education, but was dealt with, I think we need to say, in a very dismissive way. Their experiences, their knowledge, their contribution, their willingness to work with the new state, was not appreciated as much as it should be. And finally, today, what he had to say, the experiments with the brigades, given the utter failure of our trajectory, 26 years later, if you look at unemployment, if you look at inequality and poverty, if you look at youth unemployment, I believe, Bobana, that education with production, the ideas is still absolutely pertinent. And so is the question of socially useful work. And while Patrick he might have, but I haven't come across it, spoke in great detail about ecology and the environment, I think these ideas lends itself to not a crude, crass economic growth trickle-down version, the separation of the technical with the academic. All of those ideas are still relevant. So I think I really should stop here to perhaps give Kevin and Bobana a bit of time to maybe respond to some of these points and the questions. And I think we have about half an hour, slightly more, to deal with the many questions posed by people. And perhaps I want to end by saying that this life, this history, this experience tells us that the view that the Tina argument, there is no alternative, is just not true. On the one hand, we believe in the Temba argument, which also means hope. There must be an alternative, or there are plenty of alternatives. And some of these alternatives were developed, not to their conclusion, of course, with a lot of contradictions. One of the things the book does is not romanticize the struggles, but there are germs of a different developmental trajectory contained. Thanks very much, Linda.
Okay, thank you very much. Over to you, Kevin and Bobana, to give brief responses, and then we've got about 5 questions that I will set to you. But first, a response from to Salim.
Yes, thanks very much, Salim, both for your, I think, over-flattering remarks about the book, but now I really appreciate the number of things that you brought out. Likewise, Bobana, the issues that you brought out about all his publications and so on, especially as I didn't in my introduction mention his founding of Mehi wa Dikgang, Botswana's first independent newspaper, which is absolutely essential in giving strength to journalism as the fourth estate in Botswana's democracy. Without it, until that came, there was really just the government's daily news, which was mostly about what some minister said yesterday, and could be viewed almost as propaganda. Here was an independent newspaper that he founded originally in 1968 in Surrey as a simple news sheet, all in Setswana, in order to spread news around within the local community. It sort of went up and down a bit over the next few years, quite often going out of print and then coming back depending on who there was to try and organize it. But once he founded the proper newspaper in 1984, it really took off and has been an enormously important role to play in Botswana's development and history and so on. Since then, and Patrick, of course, then later in his life, having a regular column on it, when he would write about anything that came into his mind. He would explain things about what was happening elsewhere in the world. he would also use it as a voice for complaining about something not being done right by the government, but then also highlight all sorts of things like the San, the Bushmen, Basawa, their plight, and all sorts. So yes, I absolutely agree with Bobana that his publications range a huge range, and his facilitating of publications through the journal of the FEP journal, giving people writing and working on similar sort of things to Patrick a real voice. The role of his memoirs, Salim, you asked specifically. Yes, it was. I wasn't able to make contact with people that might have been able to tell me about his early life, his family, and so on. And in fact, he was able to start writing his memoirs quite late in life, more or less when he had retired from actively promoting his ideas. By visiting South Africa when he was finally allowed back, and then meeting up with his family, and talking about the past, and then visiting the places in Pietermaritzburg, Durban, and so on where he grew up. And it was from that he realized, yes, I can really start writing this. So I was very fortunate to have that, and able then to write about that early period of his life. Unable, unfortunately, to find for that really early period any alternative sources. So I was sort of a little uneasy by how much I had to rely on it. But as soon as he started to play a public role in giving up the support for apartheid and became active against it, of course, a whole lot of other sources came. But it was a very useful throughout his early years in Botswana, provided a useful chronology so that I had a basic structure for those early years, which was extremely helpful. Interestingly, you should mention the number of people that he was involved in and volunteers that worked with him, that he influenced and that influenced him, and so on. That you should mention Robert Oakeshott, because in fact, I'm just started embarking on a biography of Robert Oakeshott, who was involved in a great many other things besides the pioneering work he did in Botswana. A fascinating life about which I will no doubt tell you all more when it is nearing completion and I'm trying to promote it. But perhaps I can pass, Bobana, have you more to say in response to Salim?
Regarding the bibliography, it's at the moment undergoing a production with Miri Publishing House, and they will be handing over to Charles Bewley to digitize, and even we've got a Creative Commons license to make sure that it reaches education researchers worldwide. Now, regarding the, I'll just pull out the fundamentals of production. Regarding the difficult question, Salim, about the perceptions or misconceptions regarding education with production. At some point, Pat actually, the government, the education minister, and a number of Swaneng alumni and all that, designed the curriculum with this civic education or development studies program. Maybe the suspicion came from, really unfounded, but maybe where each time a political ideology seems to go with education with production, Pat would, really work with those very hopeful, as in the Zimbabwe, the ZIMFEP, context, and even, the BNF or Botswana National Front issue in 1998. When he broke up with politics, he actually wrote a piece, an article, that as to why he has chosen the column as opposed to politics, because politicians were not really representing, the ideals or the philosophy well. Instead, it would get politicized and then it would be taken out of context. And then he focused this attention on writing and writing and writing about education with production, how he saw it. And as a practitioner, he was very much involved in actually making it realizable through the vocational training, the brigades. The brigades in Botswana, spread like felt fire. And then at some point, of course, the diamonds and other things came into the economy sort of progressed a little. And then some of the brigades did not slow down, sort of, but they are being revived. And as I mentioned, the Vision 2016 and the Vision 2036, PET's ideas, and even in every little book about education in Botswana, PET's ideas would always, be there, and they've been tested. The Swanen story, the Madiba secondary school, the Tonota, and I'm glad to say that in the last week, in the Daily News, Muyen College, that was built around the concept of the Tiger Kloof, and is also now using their water resources to produce. Because of COVID, I mean, we are sort of high and dry, and production and learning by working is what has to subsist now. I think with that, Salim, a lot of readings that we have to bring out, and I'm glad to say some of them have been published full text, and we are working even on digitizing some of the very useful information that the knowledge from PET's ideas that came about. Thank you.
Are we passing on to questions? I don't know.
I think so.
I think I'm not sure. Linda?
Linda, are you there?
We might have lost Linda. Perhaps we could start with the questions that are in the Q&A. I see a few. In the absence of Linda, maybe I could perhaps read one, and hopefully she'll join us. I'm sure Corina is trying to get hold of her. Shall I go ahead, Corina?
Yes, please. Yes,
Okay.
please.
Corina says Linda's PC crashed, unfortunately. Okay, there's one from Peter Vale. I'm just going to read out the question, and perhaps Corina can make us aware of other questions. Peter Vale says, I've not read the book, but wonder if the presentation of Afrikaner seeing the light as was presented is a little simplistic. So has the issue of the role of the Catholic Church in the mid and late 1950s been sufficiently considered? After all, ideas of liberal Catholicism was on the move, and John 23 became the Pope. Was van Rensburg influenced by this sense of excitement? There is some evidence that other Catholics in the foreign ministry at the time were moved by this. Then did Kevin look at the archive of the Department of Foreign Affairs when Patrick was serving in Leopoldville? Finally, what did he study as a student? Let's take another Tom Holzinger, who features prominently in the book as well, poses the question, Bobana, you said FEP would prepare a digital edition. Do you mean a digital edition of the biography? Perhaps, Bobana, you could deal with that question first, and then Kevin, if you could perhaps respond to Peter Vale, if that's okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Please go ahead, Bobana.
This is the bibliography we are talking about. It will be published in print, and then as well as digital. So are we all right with that?
I think that's fine. That's fine. I mean, we can come back to the question if need be, but go ahead, Kevin, in response to Peter Vale.
Yeah. Yes, I'm not muted. Yes, thanks, Peter, for that interesting question. Yes, in the presentation, I did perhaps refer to a little simplistically about his seeing the light about Afrikanism. It was very much more complex than that. And he gradually, I mean, he never saw the light about Afrikanism. He saw the light, to the extent that one can use that phrase at all, in terms of apartheid. Afrikanism, he had immersed himself in the culture of it because he had been brought up as an Anglophone Natal person, and it wasn't until he went to his first job in just a year after the Afrikaner National Party had come to power that he discovered that his father actually was, according to his birth certificate, his father was an Afrikaner. And so this introduced him to a whole new aspect of white culture in South Africa that he took on board. And it was only later, after, as Bobana said, he was in the library in PvR while studying for his degree, that he started reading things written by people who were of Indian origin and Black Africans, and so he gradually came to the conclusion that the idea of this separation was really not to do for the benefit of each individual racial group, but was really in order to entrench domination and white supremacy and domination. And that is what he then finally was able to make the thing against it when he went to Leopoldville in the Belgian Congo. And that was during the Congo's colonial time still. But he came across people, other diplomats from around the world, who introduced him to a much more broader worldwide view of humanity. And also he met and shook the hands of Black people who were invited to various diplomatic social events and so on. And it sort of dawned on him, where have I been all these years? And of course, once he then decided, I'm going to rebel against this apartheid position on moral grounds, then he really went all out against it and was extremely active in the Transvaal and Johannesburg and so on. Had many friends of all so-called races in Sophiatown, which was still existing then in Johannesburg. You know, I didn't mean to sort of dismiss and be unsubtle about the Afrikanism on that. You ask interesting about the Catholic Church, and because of John the 23rd and the whole Catholic revival and full of new ideas, Patrick, I'm afraid, had by then long moved on from Catholicism. right from at least 1950. He'd completely given up on Catholicism. So he wouldn't have paid any particular attention to that, I think. And he was much too, in the 50s, he was much too much involved with re-identifying himself and finding out his own personal philosophy. What did he study for his degree? I ought to know, but I can't honestly remember. You have not read the book, I know, so it's not fair on you, but it is well over 18 months since I wrote it. English was prominent. History he did, and very interestingly learned the white Afrikaner version of South African history, which stayed with him to some extent, I think, all his life. He never quite got away from all of that. What else? Philosophy, I can't quite remember. I'm really sorry about that. But that's the way things go. What else was, I think does that cover?
That was yeah, the questions are coming in thick and fast, Kevin.
Okay.
There was one question asked by Charles earlier about whether there was contact with Bram Fischer, but I see Thomas Holzinger has responded to Charles in this way. When Pat was a Liberal Party organizer, he went to at least, I presume he went to at least one multiracial party, perhaps at Fischer's house.
He went to quite a few.
Oh, okay.
Pat was a party man, and if there was a party,
right.
he was there.
Enjoyed the parties, yes.
Yeah.
Kevin, there are a number of questions that came in before this webinar, and they relate to Patrick's legacy and what is to be learned from education with production and so on. So perhaps I could just read them to you. There's one from Prof. Bakile Moshechwa, whom you presumably know from the Botswana Open University. He asks, how can Botswana leverage the Van Rensburg legacy to improve technical skills development? What lessons can be learned from a rebel who moved to a totally undeveloped country and started brigades? Questions about legacy and lessons. There's a similar question asked by Mike Hawks, who says, what do the speakers feel are the main aspects of Patrick's legacy in terms of development and educational practices in Botswana today? Mikala Maastrand also asks a similar question. They're all phrased slightly differently, asking slightly different aspects of the same question. How have the experiences of the brigades affected policymakers in surrounding countries as concerns education, and specifically academic as well as non-academic education and training? Let me just fit in one more question for Bobana. Those are all about education, legacy, lessons, what is to be learned. Bobana, there was a question for you from Kathy Higgins. Why was Patrick's daughter Kathleen not mentioned in the history, in the list of his children? So first, I think the questions of legacy and lessons for all of you, but perhaps specifically Kevin, and then we go on to the other.
Yes, quite a few questions there to consider. Can I start with the legacy? I think the most important legacy, it depends where you look. The most important legacy for Botswana, I think, was probably the brigades, in that they, in a practical sense, and the extent to which they still exist and can be revived, I think they had the biggest and widest impact within, specifically within Botswana, and also within Botswana, the foundation of Mehi newspaper, what he did for journalism there. Those ideas then also spread much further afield, but those other aspects of legacy were the impact and influence that this whole experience through the 1960s and 70s had on the people who worked there, and things that they went on to do was spreading his ideas much further afield. I think his receipt of the Right Livelihood Award provided contacts around the world, and that's what led him to the Caribbean as well as to Alaska, and where his ideas were being taken on board quite considerably. The extent to which those still have impacts in those places, I personally, I don't know. But within the region, Zimbabwe took on the Foundation with Production Ideas, the Education with Production Ideas, very strongly in the initial years. But there was, as there was within Botswana and in South Africa, a strong education establishment that was not willing to allow these revolutionary ideas that were being brought back by returning refugees, freedom fighters, people who'd been in camps in Zambia and Mozambique, were coming to Zimbabwe in 1980, 81 in large numbers. They were actually allocated certain farms in which to live, and their education with production really played a major role and persisted right up until the early 2000s for 20 years, but were not allowed into the rest of the educational establishment. So although the politicians talked grand words about these kind of ideas, the establishment saw it as far too revolutionary and didn't want to upset the whole thing. That, in fact, the farms on which they worked fell victim to the land reclamation project, the chaotic way that was done. The farms were basically confiscated, and so those ideas collapsed. In South Africa itself, I think the influence is still there and has potential, especially as Selim said, with a very high unemployment, and especially among the youth. The way that these ideas of combining productive education with academic has tremendous potential. And I think, as Babana stressed, within Botswana, under the COVID restrictions, people all around the world are realizing they are having to rely upon themselves and make things for themselves and learn how to be a little bit more self-sufficient. So there is, I think, plenty of potential for that sort of thing spreading and having more impact.
Related to that, Kevin, is a question by Marcus Solomon, which is there any evidence that the ANC was asked by Patrick to consider education with production? Well, so there's regional legacy, but was there any impact on the ANC?
At Samafco, the ANC school in Tanzania, yeah, definitely. Patrick was constantly, whenever they would have a conference about educational policy, Patrick was always invited. He had an influence there, although they never really took it on fully in the way that he wanted. So they were well aware of his ideas that he was pushing them. But Patrick was not a man to lobby politicians. So maybe if he had been, it might have taken off a bit more once the educationists were able to return to South Africa and join up with the other educationists who were still there in South Africa. I think Patrick was also, he maybe made a mistake in going to Kangwane, the Swazi so-called homeland, in what was then the Eastern Transvaal, now in Palanga. He managed to persuade them to adopt these ideas, and that was going well. But then, of course, Kangwane ceased to exist come 1994, and that collapsed. So I think there could have been tactical ways that he could have worked a bit more successfully and got more attention. But I think the focus of the early education policy after liberation in South Africa was too much on redressing the damage done by a racist system and how to undo a racist system and bring a greater egalitarian non-racial system. And so I don't think anybody was quite prepared for a completely new system.
We're running out of time rapidly and we still want to get to Botswana, but while we're on this, and there's a string of questions and issues related to what we're talking about now that are really interesting in the chat, but there's one that I think also relates. It's from Lesang Maswabi. He says, at least we're aware of a bit that's left of Patrick van Rensburg Foundation for Education Production here in Botswana, but what can be traced back to Zim and South Africa? Is there anything that is left of what he did in Zim and in South Africa?
Not that I am aware of. The ideas must be held in the memories of people involved, but I haven't been, you know, I was doing a biography of Patrick rather than an education system of the region, and I haven't personally been keeping up to date with that. Maybe Salim can enlighten a bit more.
Salim, do you want to answer that, and then we go to Botswana?
All right. Regarding the legacy, there is something.
Oh, okay, yeah, go ahead. But there was the specific question from Kathy Higgins about why was Patrick's daughter Kathleen not mentioned in the list of his children? But the legacy too. Thanks.
Is that addressed to me? I suppose so, but then I heard a rumor about him having a daughter. I was unable to find anybody who could tell me anything more, so you know, it was one of those things that I wasn't able to find out about. I obviously did not follow the right contacts, for which I really regret. But.
Okay, let's have a few quick words from Botswana and Salim about the legacy and what remains and the lessons. And then I'm sorry, I think we'll probably have run out of time, although there are many, many questions still left.
I was about to talk about the ETSSP. This is a strategy for education that I think I would say in hindsight, because at the time, Pelonomi Benson was the Minister of Education, and then a lot of research went into the ETSSP strategy. This is about education of production and maybe, you know, reviving or rejuvenating the brigades because they had actually spread around the country. And then the brigades there is a shift currently to really focus on vocational training, realizing that the diamonds are dwindling and a knowledge-based economy, that's the whole shift where the country is going with emphasis on production on self-sustainability, or even, you know, using the lessons that we learned when the economy was still, you know, on the shining side. And Pat has written a lot about this, and it has gone into the literature that we have actually disseminated to the brigades. There was another project of book donation. There was text content that had been developed, as in working with English, environmental studies, cultural studies, social or other development studies on really how we could combine education with production. So we believe the role of Mutusi, the role of the FEP, the refound FEP by the refounding son, Mutusi, is taking us there, because we are looking at all these projects, including even the legacy of seminars that would help us, you know, have conversations around education with production and actually do tangible projects with the brigades and other vocational training centers. I think in a nutshell, that's that about the ETSSP.
Okay, thank you, Salim. I think we were asked to close the session at 5:15. So if you could keep your response short, we will then thank all the panelists and the participants.
I've just been looking at the comments and the questions, and there's so many wonderful issues for us to debate and discuss. We might have to look for another forum, you know, to continue this discussion. But I'm so glad that these questions are raised. I mean, Leon Tickley, for example, talks about SOMAFCO, which the book discusses in some detail, as well as the relationship with Mohammed Tickley, for example. That's very important ideas. There's a question about NAPI, Linda, which you would be interested in. And I think the book makes the point that really disappointingly, the NAPI process and reference to Patrick's work and the education of production was hardly mentioned. This is the uncomfortable truth. And there are particular reasons, there's speculation about that. So all these issues are important. I think there was some misunderstanding because the book does talk about Joanne in a number of instances. In fact, that point I made about Patrick saying he's the last standing Maoist came from Joanne, actually. So I think there was a bit of a misunderstanding there. But many other questions, Linda, unfortunately, in terms of government policy, you know, these ideas have not been implemented, but it remains pertinent. It remains possible, I believe. And it's been taken up by a number of social movements who are going back to those alternatives and the possibilities. So I think the legacy lies in that fact. There is a legacy, and it's not a legacy that has been taken forward, unfortunately, by government. But it's a legacy that remains in the hearts of many people, and like those experiments, not just education with production, but worker education, early childhood, community-based early childhood development, the work people like Marcus Solomons and others who are present with us, their examples, their praxis, all of those things must be seen together with this legacy that has been left. And I mean, the legacy exists, it's behind Botswana, and we need to continue to study it, and we need to understand the new contexts, but I think the ideas remain relevant and pertinent, because what has been tried has failed to a great extent. And I think some of the issues around education with production holds great promise. Thanks, Linda.
Okay, well then it remains to me just to say thank you so much to the panelists, to Kevin for writing the book, to Wits Press, Corina van der Spoel and Michelle Halland for organizing this session, to the really amazing questions that we have not answered half of. It's made this event really exciting and shows that the debate has just begun, the discussion has just begun. Thank you very, very much for coming to the session, and congratulations once again to Kevin for a really superb book and a very timely book as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.